I wanted to avoid a barking dog at home, and I wanted, the better internet, but right before everybody came on, I froze. So hopefully that will not happen, but if it does, we've got our bases covered. I am really happy to be here this afternoon to talk with Dr. John Edgar Tidwell, Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Kansas, about his big idea essay, Pandemic, Interracial Strife, and the Saving Grace of the Humanities. And for those of you who don't know, the big idea is a Humanities Kansas initiative showcasing fresh ideas from humanities scholars that spark conversations about ideas that shape our world. And this is certainly one of those topics. So just a few housekeeping reminders. We have you all muted, but as questions come up or comments, feel free to type them in the chat. And if you're watching on Facebook, we have someone watching that as well. So type in your questions or comments in there. Feel free to chat with each other in the chat box. That is great too. As questions come up, we'll address them, and we'll also give you time to answer, ask questions at the end. So, everyone, Professor Tidwell, and Edgar, I'm going to start with a question about, people have been talking about this notion of a twin pandemic. This idea of we have, the health pandemic with COVID, right? But also, particularly, after the shooting of George Floyd, we've had this pandemic of, as you talk about in your big idea, interracial strife. So can you break down this concept for us, this idea of twin pandemic?
Thank you all for coming and signing on. This is probably a very good time. Instead of going out to lunch, we can try and feed the mind just a little bit. I come actually at the request of Julie Mulvihill to talk a little bit about what a big idea would be in terms of thinking about the humanities and its relationship to where we are today. And she asked me to do this at a time when it seems like the world was just sort of falling apart. We had the announcement about the pandemic, and all of a sudden it just mushroomed into something that was really, really great. As time went on, it's gotten, of course, increasingly worse, and it has raised all kinds of questions that has to do with what are our responsibilities toward each other in terms of this pandemic. The other thing that happened almost simultaneously was the death of George Floyd. And it was really tragic to see this replayed over and over and over and over again, because what we were witnessing was a modern day lynching, as it were. And as a consequence, you had a lot of people who normally would not have been too affected by this, all of a sudden caught up in what this man's death meant to them individually. And so for me, it was quite a feat to see that people who were not of color were affected dramatically by this. So there was something about this man's death that seemed to affect all of us. So if you look at the response that people made, then you'll see that it was one of those moments where people just seemed like they were saying, enough already. We can't take it anymore. This is one of those moments where when you see this kind of travesty take place on TV, and being played over and over and over again, then it shows you how effective social media had become in terms of revealing things that in the past would have probably been swept under the rug, and nothing would have happened. So those two things came together for me at a moment when it seems as though we had people reacting for the first time collectively to begin to ask the question of, well, what is going on in the world? Why is it that we're enduring this kind of assault on our humanity? Why are we now being set upon in a way that indicates that all of us truly are being affected? And I think when people began to see that they themselves were connected to all of this, then therein lies the nature of the humanities and how the humanities can have an impact on the way in which we respond to all of these things. So it's a kind of a roundabout way of getting at an answer, Valerie, but it's a way by which we can talk about a number of questions. In the little piece that I wrote, I wound up asking in the first paragraph questions like, am I not an American? And if you notice, that becomes an issue with both of these pandemics, both of these travesties. Am I not entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Don't I deserve a chance to realize the American dream? Am I not a human being? So those are questions that came out of the travesties that we were witnessing in this way, I think, for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, you bring up so much in such a short amount of time. And I really like, how you talk about this collective reaction, right? And both of these pandemics seem to have kind of devolved in some ways into binaries, right? So for the COVID pandemic, we have kind of this idea of civil liberties versus the public good, right? So especially when we're talking about something like mask wearing or stay-at-home mandates, there's people on opposite sides of the spectrum, and with this interracial strife, we also have this notion of us versus them, right? And here where I'm at, and to Topeka, we have a lot of that going on as well. Black versus white, police, anti-police protests. So how can humanities help us bridge these binary outlooks?
Well, that's a very good question. And it's a good question because what it asks us to do is to think more specifically about let's say the health pandemic. As we begin to consider the health pandemic, one of the issues that comes to mind is who is affected most by this? And initially what we saw were mainly whites. But as data was gathered, and as we began looking at the results of other kinds of research, we began to see that a number of people were being disenfranchised, but most of those people were individuals who were not of color. And so the question then comes back to, am I an American? You know, am I a citizen? And do I deserve the right to pursue life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? What is being done in terms of trying to find the solution to the health problem that would encompass protections for me as a person not of color? So you begin thinking about the ways in which individual groups were being affected. The group that, of course, I think was probably most most harshly affected by all this would be Native Americans. There seemed to be very little attention being given to Native Americans from the very beginning. And as we consider the importance of being more inclusive in terms of collecting the data and trying to find remedies, then we had to stop and think about what are we doing for Native Americans, all right? And then we have, of course, a lot of Latinx folk who were being affected, but who initially were not really being counted in terms of the people who were being being almost destroyed by this pandemic. So you had to stop and consider different groups who were not being initially included in the data gathering, and who therefore were not even being considered as people who were in need of some sort of assistance in all of this. All right. Now, on the other side of all this, with thinking about the racial strife that was occurring, we have a lot to appreciate, I think, in terms of Black Lives Matter. They did over the years, the last several years that they've been in existence, they did a marvelous job of pointing out the need for a different kind of policing, so that people felt as if they were having their own rights as citizens being respected in all of this. And part of the problem, of course, is that it seems like Black people were being disadvantaged in so many different ways. So the people who were being killed, if you will, by the police were the ones who brought everything to the table for everybody to talk about. What I find sort of interesting is that the response that most people made was more of a collective response, which is to say that having witnessed this sort of legal lynching that took place, you found that people were just so outraged that people of all different political persuasions, racial backgrounds, and so forth, got together collectively and marched and protested. And this is where it becomes really, it requires, I think, a teasing out of some of the differences that need to be made. The biggest one is that there seems to be an undercurrent of anti-Americanism taking place. And so with the group of people who were protesting, they would infiltrate the protests, and instead of just protesting, you know, the injustice of it all, they would seek to loot, to burn, to shoot, to create chaos as a way of destabilizing the whole movement itself. And this is where the media, I think, was very slow to catch on to what was going on. And so as we began to become clearer about who's actually doing what, then it became obvious that there were efforts being made to destabilize the whole movement and to create an environment in which everything was being shown to be not effective or not helpful or not useful in its own way.
Yeah. Well, it is historian. My mind is spinning now over all the comments you've made, because your comment about Native Americans, which is, you know, right on point, makes me think, you know, of the 19th century and smallpox, right? And you know, how so much of that population was destroyed by, you know, that disease in a previous area. And as you were just now talking about, you know, the undercurrent of anti-Americanism and that destabilization, I'm thinking about, you know, the 1960s and then the civil rights movement in COINTELPRO with, you know, the FBI. And so, you know, bringing in the humanities that way in terms of history. But also it was, you know, you were talking and you bring this up in your big idea essay, you know, you invoke Langston Hughes and his poetry, you know, that is still so apt and on point today that it's kind of amazing. And yeah, if you want to share some of his poetry for us, that would be awesome.
One of my favorite collections by Hughes is The Panther and the Lash. It was a collection that was actually published right after his death. And the subtitle of The Panther and the Lash is Poems of Our Times. And if you get a chance to read through the collection, not long and extremely readable, you'll see that Poems of Our Times starts in 1925. So it's like a collected poems, and he selected from over his many, many years. But here's one that, I don't know, maybe it might be familiar to some of you. It's titled Death in Yorkville. And the subtitle is James Powell, Summer 1964. How many bullets does it take to kill a 15-year-old kid? How many bullets does it take to kill me? How many centuries does it take to bind my mind, chain my feet, rope my neck, lynch me unfree? From the slave chain to the lynch rope, to the bullets of Yorkville, Jamestown, 1619 to 1963, Emancipation Centennial, 100 years, not free. Civil War Centennial, 1965. How many centennials does it take to kill me, still alive? When the long, hot summers come, death ain't no jive.
Wow.
It's a powerful poem, it seems, because it invokes memories of a number of folk, including this 15-year-old kid, James Powell, who was killed in 1964. But if you think about it, there are a couple of poems that he wrote also about Money, Mississippi. And this was on the occasion of Emmett Till being lynched. And so if we think about Hughes as being a topical poet, or a poet that has written in a way that suggests his poetry is still relevant to today, then these are just a few of the poems that you could cite.
Yeah, absolutely. And that first line, it hit me in the gut, you know?
Yes.
Yeah, in a way, it's like, it's so sad that it is still so relevant today. And that brings me to my next question, which is kind of, what do you say to those people who have been untouched by either, you know, the COVID pandemic or racism indeed, we have people out there, you know, who did deny that either exists. So how can we have an exchange? Because you use that phrase, and I really liked it in your essay, an exchange of ideas with someone whose views are, you know, entrenched or just very different from our own.
Well, one of the things when I read your question, it took me straight back to John Donne, all right, Meditation 17, where he writes, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." So when I think about people who would like to see they are unconnected to all the events that are taking place today, it takes me straight to John Donne out of the 17th century. And I'm sure that there are many others, of course, you know, preceding all of that, but this is the one that came to my mind first. But it's the whole notion that we are all connected in some way, shape or form, so that when we lose somebody, that loss is something that affects all of us, or it should affect all of us. And for people who don't understand that, it's sort of sad, because they envision themselves as sort of disconnected from humankind. And what's important about the humanities is that it finds a way of connecting us and making us see how we are responsible for each other. It makes us see how things that seem so disparate and different still have a way of making us connected in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's an excellent idea. Let me ask you this, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute. What would you say to those who argue that the humanities is not a panacea?
Well, one of the ways of thinking about this is that if a person is so entrenched in his or her belief that you can't have a conversation with them, then it's probably useless to try to convince them. But the people that are willing to have a conversation, the people who are willing to ask the question, those people who are willing to entertain different possibilities, those are the people you really want to talk with, because they are the ones who have the possibility of broadening their horizons and thinking more broadly about who they are in connection with other people. So I think in part it has to do with choosing the right people to share these ideas with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to open it up to questions in a minute. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and we will get to that in just a second. I just have really, one more kind of question for Edgar, and that is, again, so much packed into this brief essay, and just in our short conversation here, like I said, my mind is just buzzing with all of these different kinds of connections. You cite several African-American authors in your essay. We've talked a little bit about Hughes, but you also cited June Jordan and former President Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope. Can you talk a little bit about both Jordan and Obama's book?
When I encountered June Jordan, it was through an essay that she had published in a book called civil wars. And it was a collection of her pieces, speeches and short essays that she'd given over the years. And the people that I got interested in, President Obama and June Jordan, talked about the nature of love. And as they talked about love, they talked about the ways in which our society as a whole can be genuinely improved if we understood what love was. Now, love can mean many different things to different people. When June Jordan put together her collection, she had in mind the fact that here she is, a Black feminist, writing at a time when feminism was looked upon as a challenge to a lot of people. And she felt like it was important for people to understand that she was thinking about her own identity and the nature of what it would take for her to identify herself in a positive way so that she could in turn have a wonderful impact on humanity from her particular perspective. All right, so a Black feminist perspective. So when I tried to find one little sentence out of this great big paragraph that I thought was really nice, but if you'll indulge me for just a moment, I'd like to read just a little bit of it. I am entering my soul into a struggle that will most certainly transform the experiences of all the peoples of the earth, as no other movement can, in fact, hope to claim. Because the movement into self-love, self-respect, and self-determination is a movement now galvanizing the true, the unarguable majority of human beings everywhere. This movement explicitly demands the testing of the viability of a moral idea. That the health, the legitimacy of any status quo, any governing force must be measured according to the experiences of those who are comparatively powerless. Virtue is not to be discovered in the conduct of the strong vis-a-vis the powerful, but rather it is to be found in our behavior and policies affecting those who are different, those who are weaker or smaller than we. How do the strong, the powerful treat children? How do we treat the aged among us? How do the strong and the powerful treat so-called minority members of the body politic? How do the powerful regard women? How do they treat us? When I discovered this, I was teaching at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and that's been some years ago, about 12, 15 years ago. And that one has always stuck with me. And it stuck with me because it seems like what she's trying to find a way of doing is to make sure that those who are powerful use their power not to separate themselves from everybody, but to find a way of using their power to accommodate the needs of everyone. And by sharing in this way, what you're doing is improving their lives, and in improving their lives, you're actually improving your own. So there's more we could talk about with regard to that, but with President Obama, it was a similar experience in reading his autobiographies. There was something very powerful about the way in which he rendered his acquaintanceship with the people who were less fortunate. You know, he was a community organizer, and he saw a lot of people, and he learned to admire a lot of things about people who were less fortunate. And in so doing, what he did was he found energy, and I think he found a reason for being in his own politics, as he discovered the wealth of humanity among those people who were being disenfranchised. So, and that's very brief. I mean, to talk about Obama means to say that we can talk about a lot of things for a while.
Yeah, yeah. Again, just so many things coming up in these brief snippets. And so I'll open it up. If anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat. Feel free.
Or comments you'd like to make.
Yeah, or comments. We have a question from Leanne. What do you make of the idea that we are more connected than ever via online platforms such as this, social media, yet seemingly more polarized? How do we overcome the tendency of social media to gravitate only to people and media that express the same beliefs as our own? And what role can the humanities play in that?
Wow.
Big question.
That's a big question, Leanne. But it's a good question. For me, as an educator, a lot of things come back to what we have done to foster in people the ability to read critically, write critically, and speak critically, which means that we find ourselves in positions to exchange ideas and offer critiques of ideas. Not to say that we're going to force somebody to think like us, but what we're going to do is to listen to all kinds of possibilities. And in this way, we broaden our minds, we broaden our horizons, we begin to see things in an extended way rather than from within the narrow orbit that a lot of people tend to do. When people begin thinking in terms of silos, they see themselves as, you know, just in that one small area. But if you begin to see yourself outside of that, then you can see that, that there's a whole world out there of possibilities. And that's what we really want, is for people to consider the possibilities, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that idea. Consider the possibilities. I also really love how you've managed to bring in, you know, during this brief conversation, poetry and literature, women's studies, history, philosophy. I think we have all of this covered in the humanities, so totally arguing your point. We have another question from Leslie. She asks, Dr. Tidwell, what are your favorite novels that best hold the, quote, saving grace of the humanities?
Oh, Lord. You know, that's a good question, because it asks me to stop and think about one or two works that actually do that. Yeah. Lately, I've been doing some reading of Eddie Glaude's book. Some of you have heard of it, Begin Again. And it's a book in which he takes on most of the nonfiction prose of James Baldwin. And what he tries to show is that James Baldwin's body of work asks a lot of questions that are relevant to us today. And so if I were to be forced to answer that question in terms of one or two texts, I would probably go back to what I still consider maybe the finest short story that we have, and that is Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin. If you get a chance, it's a long short story, but my goodness, it's just so compelling. It's compelling because Baldwin hits you right here in the heart. You know, there are others who do something similar, perhaps. There are others who are trying to make you think differently about the world. But with Baldwin, it's all about the question of the heart and love, and I think that's what makes him so powerful. Um, we can always go to Beloved, which I think is just a fabulous, fabulous novel. Um, or we could think about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, all right, which is a funny novel, actually. It's more of a comedy than anything. And it took me years to understand that. But these are some of the books that you can look at and think about.
One of the things I really like in this discussion and in your essay as well is kind of this overarching theme that you bring up about love, right? And I think that comes through in some of the choices that you were just speaking about as well. So,
well, the world is not going to change, I think, on the basis of hate. I think if you try to reform the world in terms of hate, then you're always going to have, this sort of opposition that takes place. But if you think about it in terms of changing the world in terms of love, you try to find those things that people have in common. And with that, you not only get change, but you'll get change that will be longer lasting, it seems to me.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see. We have a question or a comment from Esther, who says, I love Sunny's Blues. Dr. Tidwell, you have demonstrated so beautifully throughout this conversation how powerfully the humanities can show us common ground. But what are your suggestions for beginning that conversation with someone whose views are very different from your own and may not even want to join a dialogue?
In one of my book talks, I gave had a discussion of Baldwin's which one was it? Not Going to Meet the Man. It was it'll come to me in a second. But when the way in which I start my book talks is I ask people for their opinions of the book. Just generally overall how they feel about it. So I'm not trying to push an agenda. What I'm trying to do is to find a way in which we might be able to have a conversation about the book. And this one elderly white lady came in and said, he is just filled with hate. And I had to count to 5 before I said anything, because it was like, of all the people to accuse of being a hate monger, Baldwin was probably one of the last people that I would describe in that particular way. And so I asked her, I said, well, if you wouldn't mind, hold on to that thought until we discuss a little more about the book. And we'll come back to you and see if you still hold the same opinion. And at the end of the hour and 15 minutes, we talked about the book. She finally said, I think I need to go back and reread that book. So that to me was a victory, because it had been very easy for her to remain really steadfast in her vision and her initial assessment, but she was willing to think about it. And that's about as much as you can ask people to do in any situation like that. So that is what I try to do, is try to find a way of getting people to say, well, let me think about it.
Yeah. That's awesome. What a wonderful exchange that you all had in that. And that leads me to a nice segue too. I wanted you all to know that Edgar also has a Speakers Bureau talk that he delivers for HK called When Freedom Changed America. So that's another avenue of exchange that can be taken. There's also an HK talk book series called Civil Rights Revisited that contains several books. March by John Lewis is in there. and some other ones that are not coming to me right at the moment, but there are all sorts of really good books. Tracy's posting those links in the chat. And these are just two ways that folks can get involved. Anybody can book these, either the Speakers Bureau talk or the talk books discussion. Get your friends together and get involved and informed from a humanities standpoint that that HK offers. So I wanted to be sure and mention those too. I don't know if you want to say anything about either of those, Edgar.
Sign me up. No, those are two avenues that I think are really effective in terms of promoting humanities. You know, we in Kansas suffer from an image problem, as you well know. And one of the things that I'm really proud to be able to say is that I'm a part of Humanities Kansas, because what it does is it gives us an opportunity to go out and about and to share ideas about the humanities in ways that people probably would have dismissed us before. But people are paying attention once we get out there and have conversations with us about the humanities. And slowly but surely, within the state, I can see how it has improved our own self-image. And I'd like to think that with some of the attention that we're bringing to people like Gordon Parks and Langston Hughes and Frank Marshall Davis, Gwendolyn Brooks, who was born in Topeka but only lived there for 2 weeks, but we still claim her. How it has enhanced our, or it is, they are enhancing our national reputation as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and President Obama, who you mentioned in your essay, also has that Kansas connection through his grandparents, so we can't leave that out. Any final thoughts or questions from the audience?
Does Ray Pence have a question or a comment?
I was typing something, but I can say it. Yeah, thank you so much, Edgar and Valerie. It is very moving. I have a million questions, but I should pick a good one. I mean, they're, you know what I mean. I think overall, the main thing I'm hoping for some help and hope on is the prospects of the humanities in the academy, because I saw a story in the newspaper today about dramatic decrease in enrollment by first-year students across the country. And of course, there's been some news at KU about various departments in the humanities falling far short of the kind of numbers that the KU Board of Regents likes us to have. So, I mean, the humanities always need help in terms of survival and making their case and so on, and you do it beautifully. So it's not so much a question, but just thank you for continuing to spread the truth of love about this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ray. I often go back to, I don't know, Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and the differences that they fought over. And with Booker T. Washington, you had somebody who was interested in education, but the sort of education he was interested in was more of a pragmatic education. What he wanted was for people to learn a trade and to be able to find their way through the world by exercising this trade, as opposed to Du Bois, who, if you read The Souls of Black Folk or any of the pieces of that, you would notice that his approach to education was not in terms of something that was pragmatic, but he felt that education, the function of education was to show people how to live. And I think that's something that has always stood the test of time with me. And to read that colleges of liberal arts are often in this day and time or being subverted because of the economic situation. I find it really sad, because what you're doing is saying to people that it's not important for you to know how to live. But I think that this is truly what should be driving us in higher education, is trying to figure out how we can live. All right? And therein lies the nature of the humanities.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a wonderful place that Humanities Kansas can take up that, space in the public humanities as well.
Yes.
And I also wanted to let everybody know that there'll be another big idea discussion next month in November. Going back to somebody that Edgar just mentioned, we're going to be talking about Gordon Parks and his influence on things. So you can follow HK on Facebook or visit humanitieskansas.org for those details. So thank you again, Edgar, for this wonderful discussion. It brought up so much for me, and I really appreciate it. You have a bunch of accolades in the chat if you want to pull that up, so you can see everybody thanking you for this this wonderful, robust discussion.
Oh.
So, thank you, everyone, and
thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll put a recording of this online on humanitieskansas.org if you want to access that at a later date. And you can find Dr. Tidwell's essay there too under Kansas Stories. So thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.